Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the Decent Garage. Today we're going to be tearing down and doing a full top end rebuild on my 2000 Honda XR400R. This bike has been a bike I rode all season this year. It's really the first season, I guess you could say, that I've been riding dirt bikes. And I really love it. I got it for cheap. I've done a couple upgrades to it. But this fall, when I went to winterize it, out of nowhere, it lost compression. So we're gonna do a full top end rebuild on it. You're probably asking, what are my qualifications to be doing a top end rebuild and to be doing a tutorial on a top end rebuild? The answer to that question is I don't have any. I'm not a mechanic. I'm not trained as a mechanic, but I figure things out. If you're new to the channel, you probably haven't seen, but I've painted my truck. I've done tons of work on my truck. I'm rebuilding a Jeep right now. I've done work on the dirt bike. So I get around by reading a lot online. I do hours and hours of reading on forums and I figure things out. So take that for what you will, but we're gonna do this and I'm gonna show you exactly how to rebuild the top end on this XR400R. All right, so the first thing you're gonna wanna do is remove the fuel tank and the seat. Now I've already done that. It's very straightforward. Couple bolts for the fuel tank, undo the line to the carburetor, and the seat is also just 2 bolts back here and it slides out. So remove those 2 things. Next, what we're going to do, we need to take the exhaust header. We need to take the exhaust headers off. And we need to take the intake boot off. So for the exhaust manifold, these are 12mm nuts, and there's 2 for each exhaust port. And for the intake boot, these are 8mm bolt. There's also a Phillips head screw holding this clamp onto the carburetor. All right, we have the exhaust headers off. We have the intake boot off. I ended up loosening the carburetor from the intake hose from the air box just a little bit, and it allowed the carburetor to move a little bit so that I could take that boot off. The next thing we're gonna do is remove the spark plug. So on this engine, the spark plug, there's a special spark plug tool for these XR400s. So I'm gonna remove that. One thing, a tip before you remove the spark plug, pull the plug wire off and then make sure everything is clean around it and then there's no dirt down in the spark plug hole. Once you pull the spark plug, that is gonna be a hole straight into the cylinder. So if there's dirt in there, that's all gonna fall down in there and you don't want that to happen. So just make sure it's nice and clean before you actually pull the plug. There is our spark plug. Let's now remove this upper oil line. So we'll just remove this clamp, pull it off, and then we should be ready to take off the upper motor mount and start taking the top end off. Let's now take the upper motor mount brackets off. So these top 2 nuts are 12mm and the bottom one is 14. Next, we're going to remove the valve clearance adjustment caps. There's 4 of them, and this is a 24mm pattern. Now, we're almost ready to start taking the top end off. The next thing we need to do, though, is to get the engine at top dead center. So I'm going to show you as best I can how to find top dead center. What you're going to do is rotate the engine over with an 18mm socket here. This is your inspection port, and I'll show you why that is relevant here in a second. So we're going to rotate the motor over until we start seeing the intake valves close. And then as a quarter turn more after they close, it'll break loose and they'll pop open. And in the inspection cover, we should be able to see a T Don't know how well you can see that, but there's a little T, and that means top dead center. All right, once we're at top dead center, we are ready to take the valve cover off. So what you want to do is start with these 3 bolts on the inside and just break them loose, and then work around to the outside ones and break those loose, and then remove them all. All of these appear to be 8mm bolts except this big one right here, which looks like a 12. Now once you have the valve cover off, notice there is a dowel here, and one of the dowels stayed in the cover. So I'm gonna remove this one with a pair of pliers and put it in the cover so I keep track of both of them. All right, now we have to take this bolt out, which is an Allen, as well as there's one 180 degrees on the opposite end. So we'll loosen this one, then we'll loosen the other one. But before we can take this off, we will then need to take the cam tensioner out. All right, to take the cam chain tensioner off, there's a Phillips head screw that holds a cap on here that I've already removed. And then what you need is a flat blade screwdriver. You'll stick it in there and you'll feel it go into the notch. And what you're gonna do is rotate it clockwise, and you'll feel that it's spring loaded. Now when I rotate that, it takes the tension off of the chain. So now what I'll do, once I have that tension off, I'll loosen up these bolts, which again are 8mm. Sorry, you can't really see, but I'm maintaining pressure clockwise with the flat blade while I loosen the 2 bolts holding the cam chain tensioner in. And there it is. Now you'll see all that tension is gone. So what we can do now is take these Allen bolts out. And there's the other one. All right, so now that we have that cam chain tensioner off and the bolts holding the cam gear onto the cam, we can remove that off of the cam, and we can gently pull the cam up and remove the bearing on the outside as well, and remove the cam. Now the next thing you're going to want to do before you do anything else, and this is common when I read a bunch on doing this online, a lot of people lose this part. There's a little plunger right there, little tiny thing. So we need to remove that. Underneath it, there's a spring. You can see it's spring loaded. That's for your automatic decompression. So we're going to remove that so it doesn't get lost. I'm just going to use a simple little magnet to remove it, and then we'll store it in a safe place. So I just used a little dental pick to reach down in there and pull out the spring because the magnet wasn't able to pull it out. All right, now I've got a piece of electrical wire. I wish I had some baling wire, but I can't find any. But what we need to do is take the cam gear out of the chain like that. Now don't let the chain drop. We're gonna put some wire around it, wrap it up here, and simply just tie it off so it kind of suspends there. You don't want to tie it on too tight or so it's hard to get off, because we're going to have to undo that knot so we can let the chain come through the head as we remove that. All right, now what we're going to do, you'll see there's another dowel here as well as one right here. So we're just going to remove those so that we don't lose them. There's one. And there's two. Now it's time to remove the head. So what we're going to do is loosen the bolts that hold the head on. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll loosen those up, take them off. Careful, they have nuts on them as well, so we don't want to let anything drop down into the block. So it's handy to have a magnet as you take this stuff off so you can be sure to have a good grip on it. All right, now we're gonna give the head a couple gentle taps with a mallet. And there it is, it's already loose. So we're gonna lift the head straight up, and as we lift it up, we're going to have to undo our wire for the cam chain and let it down through the head without dropping it into the block, and then we can tie it back up. Another thing to note, as you lift the head up, there will be a couple dowels as well, so don't let those fall either. Now it's time to remove the cylinder. So we have 4 cylinder bolts in the middle here, and then we have a bunch on the perimeter of it as well. These look like 8mm and these look like 12mm. So before we start loosening these up, and we're going to start by loosening the middle ones and then work our way out, we're going to remove this chain guide. Gonna have to finagle it out just a little bit. And make sure to get the washers out here as well. So we're going to wiggle this free, and again we're going to have to move the chain down through it. There's going to be dowels, so watch for that. The piston, once we lift the cylinder up far enough, the piston's going to fall out, so be careful and don't let the piston hit the case or damage anything. The last step of the process is to remove the piston. So what we're going to do before we remove that, I'm just going to put a couple microfiber rags down in there. One, to keep the rod from knocking onto the case, and two, if we drop a circlip, it won't fall down in there. So we'll just use a small pick to pull the circlip out. Just like that, and there's one on each side. Now we should be able to slide this cylinder out of the piston, and then the piston comes loose. Just like that. So the full top end has been removed and is ready to be rebuilt. All right, so I sent the cylinder off to get it rebored. So here's the cylinder, and you can see that little spot right there. And it's just, let me see if I can get my finger in there. I mean, just barely enough to catch my fingernail on it. I showed you guys that little nick in it and decided I might as well just get it rebored. So that should be done here in the next couple days. Today, we're going to be looking at the valves and the valve seats. So you can see there's a lot of carbon buildup here in the combustion chamber. In my research on doing a lot of this over the past couple days, I found a lot of good tests to check if the valves were seating well that I wish I would have done before I pulled the valve train off. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna relap the valves and show you guys how to do that. We'll put the valve train back together, and then we'll do that test to see if the valves are seated properly. And that way you guys can see that test so that you can perform that test prior to pulling your valve train off, so that from a diagnostic standpoint you can tell if there is an issue, which valve has the issue, and you can even get down to see close enough what part of the valve seat is not sealing how it should. So the first thing I'm going to do is just get a wire wheel and lightly clean up all the carbon off of the combustion chamber area as well as off of the valves. All right, so we have the valve seats and the combustion chamber all cleaned off. Got the valves all cleaned off, and they are in really good shape. I'm actually surprised. So what you're looking for in this process, you know, if there's carbon on them, that's fine. That may be why it didn't seat very well. The problem is if you find any pitting on the seat or the valve, you probably need to get your seats remachined and buy new valves. But I don't see any of that on mine, so I'm gonna just go ahead and lap them. So we're gonna go through this process. I'll show you how to do it. One thing, if you're watching this, from the research I've done on lapping the valves on an XR400, from what I can see, 90% of people say they're steel valves, steel seats, lap them, it's totally fine. I did find a couple people on some forums that said that the XR400 and the TRX400 valves have a special coating on them, and if you lap them, it takes that coating off and weakens the valves. I've read enough that's contrary to that belief to make my decision to just go ahead and lap them. If it ends up being a problem later on, I'll just replace the valves. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and lap them. Take that for what you will. Go ahead and do any research you want to do on that, but there is controversy as to whether you should or shouldn't lap these XR400 valves. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've got the head sitting here on a couple 2x4s. One thing we need to do prior to this is I'm going to take the valve seals out, and that's just a matter of getting some pliers and pulling them off. All right, valve seals are off. So now I bought this tool. I'll throw a link in the description to this. You can get it on Amazon or any auto parts store. Just It's like $5. It's a lapping tool. So if you remember, we have the exhaust valves over here, the intake valves right here. We have 1, 2, 1, 2. So we're going to start with the first exhaust valve. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm seating it in and making sure the valve stem clears this 2x4 and that it's not going to hit anything. Now I've got some of this Permatex valve grinding compound. So this is basically like liquid sandpaper. Okay. So you don't have to use a lot of this, but do get a little bit on every component of the valve that's going to seat with the head. Now, what I'm also going to do is put just a little bit of assembly lube on the valve stem, because what we're going to be doing is putting it in there, seating it down, and spinning it. So I don't want that just to be raw metal on raw metal. You could probably use assembly lube or even just some oil or old oil, just something to lubricate it. Okay. Stick that down in there. Now what we're going to do is use our tool. It's got like a suction cup on it. So stick it on there. Now to start with, I'm not putting much force down into there. Okay, and you can hear the sound change from kind of a coarse, grindy sound to a fine, smooth sound, and that means you've worked that lapping compound out of the joint surface. So what we can do is kind of work some of that compound back down onto that surface. If we need to, we can add more compound. And let me see if you guys can see this on camera, but you can see the new surface, and it should be very uniform, very smooth. So there shouldn't be skinny parts in the surface or parts that go over the edge right here. So I might do just a couple more turns of it, but that looks really good. Yeah, that's perfect. Good. So we've got that compound cleaned off. We're just going to leave that valve in there to let us know that that one's done. And that's exhaust number 1. We're going to move to exhaust number 2. So I'm going to go through and do all these. And then we will start putting the valve springs back on and the new valve seals. And I'll show you how to test to make sure they're seating correctly. All right, all the valves are lapped. So make sure to clean really good. Clean the seats, clean the valves off, get all that lapping compound off of there. It's basically like sand in jelly. So you don't want that in there when you start the motor or anything else like that. You don't want it to ruin any surfaces. So got the valve set aside. Now what we need to do to put the new valve seals on, and then we'll be ready to start assembling the valve train again. So here are the new valve seals, and these are very easy to just push right on there. There we go. So we will start with exhaust valve number 1. We've got the little washer we've got to put on first. We're going to put the valve in. We've got the smaller spring followed by the larger spring. And then we need our compressor tool to compress the spring down and put the keepers in. All right, there's the first one. So we're gonna do that to all the other ones, get them all in. All right, the valve train's all back in. Now what we need to do is just give it a light tap on the end of the valve stem, just 1, maybe 2 taps. So it springs the valve open and then close and helps it to seat better. So. Just like that. All right, now I want to do a test to make sure these are seated good. We're gonna thread the spark plug in so that it blocks this hole here. And then we need to fill this bowl up with some type of fluid. You could use carb cleaner, you could use gasoline, some people use water. Really anything's okay. I think people recommended gasoline because it was a little bit thinner, so it would be more, it would err on the side of showing leaks a little bit better. I think I'm probably just gonna use water just for the cleanliness of it. So, and then what we'll do is get the air compressor from about 2 inches away and blow air into each port. Now we want it to be about 60 PSI. And then if we see any bubbles coming up around the valve, then we'll know that that valve is not seated correctly or there's another issue. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, as you can see there, we put the compressed air through the ports, no air bubbles at all. So this is a test. I would recommend doing this test prior to pulling the valve train off after your tear down. That way you can have a better idea of what valve or valves are the culprit if they are having issues. So I'm really happy because they're sealed perfectly. That's excellent news. So now what we need to do is wait for the cylinder to get back. So as soon as the cylinder's back, we're gonna start putting this thing back together. All right guys, today's the day. Got the cylinder back from being bored and honed. So we got that, got our piston. We've got everything we need to throw this thing back together. Let's get this thing put back together and hope that it runs, hope that it at least has compression. So here we go. All right, so one thing I want to show you guys on this real quick. To do the boring of the cylinder, they had to remove the studs. It's not a big deal. They're easy to put back in if you know this trick. So I've got all these in. This is my last one. What you need are 2 nuts that are the appropriate thread size. So what you do is you put one on, put the other one on, get 2 wrenches, and tighten those nuts down onto themselves. And then what we can do we can tighten that down. Now the service manual doesn't give a torque spec for these, which I found kind of weird, but I'm just tightening them down very, very snug, but not too tight. I don't want to strip them out or break the studs, so I don't know. That's the best I could find on the torque spec of that. So that's how you do that. Now let's go ahead and get everything ready to put back together. All right, so let's get the piston ready to put back in the cylinder. And what you can see here is I've put some marks on the piston. This comes straight out of the factory service manual. So what we want, this is where we're going to set the gaps for each of the rings. So for the top ring, we're going to set the gap here. For the second ring, we're going to set the gap right here. For the oil rings, we're going to set the oil ring spacer right here in the middle. And then we're going to offset each of the oil rings by about 20 millimeters in both directions. So we'll have the spacer gap here, one of the oil ring gaps here, one of the oil ring gaps right here. So we're going to start with the oil rings and work our way up to the top. So we'll put the spacer ring in first. Then we'll put the bottom oil ring on. Alright, so we got those oil rings in. That was a little bit tedious. Nothing impossible by any means, but tedious nonetheless. So oil rings are in, set to the right gap. Let's get the second ring in now. Now on these rings, make sure there will be a letter and a number on either side of the ring opening. That should be faced up. Alright, and now we can put our top ring in. I'm going to put an image on the screen right now from the factory service manual to show how to tell which ring is which from the top and the second ring, how to differentiate those two. So that should help you out a little bit. All right, so we've got all those in. Once you have them in, check and make sure the gaps are where they should be. Once you get it put back on and ready to slide the piston up into the cylinder, check the gaps again at that point as well. You can't check it too many times to make sure the gaps are all correct before you put that piston in there. All right, at this point, we're ready to put the piston on the bike now. One thing we can do before we do that, if you grab your new circlips, we can put one of them in at least. Okay, we've got that in there. Now, one important thing when you put these circlips in, you'll see there's kind of this opening right here. You don't want the gap in the circlip to be lined up with that opening. So if that's the case, get in there and kind of spin it away from there just a little bit, or pull it out and reinsert it. All right, here we are over the dirt bike now. So we're gonna pull our rags out and we're gonna put our piston on. So on the piston, this in, that faces toward the intake side, which is to the back of the bike. So we're going to get our new wrist pin. And doing this, it's also important to get just a little bit of oil and put it maybe just in a little cup so you can kind of coat everything in just a little bit of oil so it helps it in that break-in process. So we're going to put a little bit of oil in here. And then we're going to start that wrist pin in. Now we're going to put it right on the crank. Perfect. Now I'm going to go around to the other side of the bike and put the other circlip in there. Perfect. Now I'm going to inspect the gaps one more time. And we are good to go to put the cylinder back on. All right, now grab your base gasket out of your gasket kit, and we're gonna have to undo our chain, feed it through there, and then we can set that gasket down. And be careful with this gasket that you don't rip it. There we go. Now we're ready to put the cylinder on. What we're gonna do before we do that, I'm gonna get some oil and oil up the piston and then oil in the inside of the bore of the cylinder as well so that it's all lubricated. All right, we've got our bore all lubricated. We've got the piston lubricated. We're gonna undo the timing chain again so we can feed it through, and then we're gonna feed the rings of the piston up into the bore one by one until it slides on nicely. Okay, we got the piston worked into the bore. That was kind of a pain in the butt, but it's doable. So we're gonna kind of slide it down, see if we can get the cylinder to sit in where it's supposed to. Now, I almost forgot the two dowels that hold the cylinder in place. So don't forget those. And then it sits right down on there. Whew! One step down. So we've got these two 8mm bolts and then the four, I believe they're 12mm to put on and torque down. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll put the torque specs for those on the screen right now, but let's get to that point. Don't forget your washers for the head bolts. So first we're going to torque them down to about 10 to 15 pounds. And then the final torque is 32 foot-pounds. And we'll go in a crisscross pattern. So we'll go here, then here, then here, then there. All right, next we need to put our chain guide in there. There we go. All right, now we can put the head on. Make sure your mating surfaces are nice and clean. So first we need to put the head gasket on, and we'll have to feed the chain through that. Okay, we've got that on now. I left the two dowels here in the head. If you took those out, make sure to put those on first. But at this point, we can now put the head on. So those two dowels will go around these two studs. We're gonna have to undo the chain again. There we go, the head is now on. All right, now we need to put our washers on each of these. And remember, there were 3 of them. The bigger one went up front by the spark plug. And be very careful putting this one in next to the cam chain so it doesn't fall in there. Now we'll put the nuts on, and these are the same torque specs as before. So we'll go 10 to 15 foot-pounds, and then we'll go up to 32 in a crisscross pattern. All right, next we're gonna put our spring and our dowel in for the decompression lever. So again, be very careful here. Don't want to drop it down in the engine. Spring first. And then the dowel. And I put a little oil on that so that it's nice and lubricated. Now we're ready to put our cam on. What I'm gonna do is you can put some oil. I'm gonna put some assembly lube just here where the cam rests, and then we'll put the cam on. You can put your cam chain around the cam for right now. Now we're gonna get the cam gear and put that on the camshaft. So we want all the lobes on the cam pointing down, with this threaded part for the bolt to put the sprocket on pointing straight up. Now we're going to put the cam chain onto the cam gear. Okay. And then we're going to put, if you remember, there was a dowel here on the end of the camshaft and a dowel here on the other end as well. So we're going to put those dowels in next. Now we're going to put the bolts into the cam gear. Then we'll just rotate it 180 degrees. Now I'm going to put it back. So let me show you a very important part here real quick. That's easiest for me just to show you this way. So I have the motor at top dead center. The T is visible through the timing window. The lobes are all down, so it looks like it's timed perfectly. But if you look here on the cam gear, there's a mark here and a mark there. When it is timed perfectly, those marks should be perfectly even with this ridge. So what this tells me is I've got the cam chain off by 1 tooth, okay? So here's gonna be the easiest way to do it. I'm gonna go over, turn the crank until the T is visible in the window. Then we'll come set this up exactly how it should be, and we can set the chain exactly where it needs to be timed correctly. All right, now you can see we are at top dead center, and there are those two marks lined up perfectly. So again, a little bit of a tedious process, but not impossible. Just take your time, do it until you get it right. If you don't get this right, it could be bad news. So, all right, the next thing we need to do is to install the cam chain tensioner. So that was pretty easy taking that out. We'll just undo the tension on it and put it back in. All right, before I put the valve cover on, I'm actually going to put the intake on so I've got better access to it. All right, now we're ready for the valve cover and the valve cover gasket. Before I do that, I'm going to put some assembly lube on the lobe, just so they have some lubrication on startup. You can use some oil or assembly lube. All right, now we've got the valve cover gasket right here, and I left my dowels inside the valve cover, but there's a dowel here and a dowel there. You could put those in to hold the gasket in place, but I've just kept them on the cover. Okay, we've got our valve cover. Right there. And then remember, we have a ton of 8mm bolts and then one right here, which I believe was 12mm. All right, just a quick tip here on all these bolts as well. If you're like me and you didn't mark which one goes where, there's 3 different lengths of these 8mm bolts. First tip, this one right here, if this is an XR400, put that in the valve cover before you put the valve cover on. Otherwise, you can't get it in at the right angle. So that's the first thing. If this is a TRX 400 quad, you'll have plenty of room to get that in. Now, the other ones, I remember generally where they went, but I didn't remember exactly. And so what you'll do, so see there's this super long one and there's this shorter one. So for example, this super long one, if I set that one in that hole, it sinks all the way and doesn't grab onto anything. So that's a good way to tell. So all you want to do is drop them all in there and make sure they're all sitting up about the exact same height. And that'll tell you that they're in the right spot. There's a few other that are tricky. Let me see if I can find them. So these ones right here are a little bit longer, but those are easy. And then everything else is about the same. All right, so to torque these all down, we're gonna do what the factory service manual says. We're gonna start at the middle one and do 4 foot-pounds and work in a crisscross pattern out from there going to 4 foot-pounds. Once we have them all at 4 foot-pounds, we'll come back and do this one at 17, and then we'll do all the other ones at 9 foot-pounds. All right, the next thing we need to do is set the valve clearance. There are plenty of videos on how to do this, so I'm not going to walk you through that. I'm just going to do it off camera, and then we'll be able to put the valve caps back on and finish the assembly and see if she's got compression and see if she'll start. So let me set that valve clearance, and then we'll finish the assembly. right, now we need to install our oil return line. Now we're going to install the motor mount. All right, a few last things. We need to install the exhaust header, and I also need to add a little bit of oil that I had drained out, probably about half a quart. So. Alright guys, there you have it. That is how you do a top end rebuild on an XR400 or a TRX400. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'm just joking guys. We're gonna try and start it up. That's why you guys are all here. So let me put the fuel tank and the seat back on, hook up the carburetor again, pull it off the stand, and we're gonna give it a whirl. So yeah, I'm super nervous. I bet you guys are too. That was a lot of work, a lot of money, so I hope it works. So let me get it all buttoned up and we'll try and start it. All right, I've got it all put back together. It's like 25 degrees outside, but I'm gonna take it outside. Just open this bay so you guys can see, and we're gonna try and kick it over and see if it starts. Probably not gonna do any more than that, and wish me luck. I hope it works. Definitely has more compression than when we started this. Oh man, it's cold out here, but it started. It's running awesome. I need to check the valves again. I'm getting some ticking from there. So I'm going to check them again, make sure they're all within spec now that it's run a little bit, but whew, nothing more accomplishing than that. So like this video if you haven't yet, that really helps out the channel. I'll be doing a lot more upgrades to the bike. It's winter right now, so we're kind of in the off season, but as soon as the season hits, we're going to be hitting some trails. I'll have some trail vlogs on here, so whew, I'm just ecstatic. We'll see you guys in the next video.